So we're just going to wait a few more minutes. So people who are just coming into the webinar can get settled in. Welcome. If you're already here. Liz, can we see how many people are in? Do we have a sense of, should we wait a little bit longer?
We'll wait just another minute.
Okay. So what did you do on your free day today?
I slept in.
Nice.
And then Owen and I were just like longboarding around. We see you guys all the time on your walks.
You do? Where are you?
Whenever like near facilities,
Yeah.
with like Mr. Westman and his
Yeah.
baby, and we always see you guys very little strolls.
Skate park out there now.
I mean, it is the best pavement on campus.
Yeah, it's nice. So we got go, and then we were just in the woods with like a hammock listening to music
Nice.
for a while.
Is that your hammock like across the way from like behind our house that we can?
No.
No, that's
Right on
another hammock.
Possum Point, like
Yeah,
way at the end.
Yes.
I think you guys can go ahead and get started if you want.
Great. Well, welcome. We're so happy that you've joined us. We're here for our senior exhibition with Andrew Park. And I'm Elizabeth Roach. I'm an English teacher, and Tad Roach, also an English teacher and head of school. Emily Pressman, chair of the history department. And Emily and I co-teach a class that Andrew is taking this year. It's a class for seniors, an interdisciplinary class in history and English, which Emily is going to describe a little bit later. So the senior exhibition is the culminating project in English for every senior. So at this point, every single senior has finished their senior exhibition, and Andrew is our last senior for doing his oral. The project itself is, the students have a choice of about 6 novels to choose from, to read on their own, and then write a 10 to 15 page paper. And then we gather with teachers, and both the student's teacher as well as another member of the English department to engage in an oral exhibition. And during the oral exhibition, we're really interested in how thinking is ongoing, that there's always another version of the paper that the student has written. And we come together and have a collaborative conversation about the paper and the ways in which we could develop, refine, complicate the argument that the student has written in the paper. And it's sort of a way to imagine what that next version of a paper would be if you were going to write it again, but it's an oral version of the paper. So it's a very rigorous and fun and exciting project to do. And I think Andrew and I have done many exhibitions together. So students do different sorts of exhibitions through their careers here. So feel pretty prepared for this moment, which may seem daunting to some of you, but actually, Andrew, I think this is about our 6th exhibition. I taught Andrew
Wow.
last year. So, and this is our 3rd one this year. So it's really fun to sort of work together and learn from each other during these orals. And before we get started, do you want to describe the course a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that as we'll talk about, we're really impressed with Andrew's paper is just the extent to which it's a reflection of the interdisciplinary nature of this particular course. So Andrew and the other students in the humanities class opted into this course for their senior English course and a history course together. The course is called, the full name of the course is History, Literature, and the Contested Past. And really what we're interested in are the different ways that novelists and historians write about and engage the past, and particularly the pasts that are most challenging, difficult, complex, layered. And so we're really interested in this conversation between and thinking about what literature can do that is different than what historians do and the kinds of evidentiary obligations that historians have, and what historians can do in conversation with literature, and how we as historians can use literature to access other kinds of things. So the whole nature of the course is to fully integrate the two disciplines. So we team teach the course together, and the students are sort of moving back and forth between literary sources, between novels, and both the secondary sources, the words of other historians about the history that the novels engage, and primary source material. So, and again, this is one of the things that Andrew has done in particularly powerful ways in this paper. So it's one of the things we're especially excited to discuss with him as we get underway.
So Andrew chose to write on Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. So we're just going to get going on the exhibition. And the first thing we ask Andrew is to articulate your thesis, and then tell us a little bit about what you want to talk about tonight. As you revisited your paper, which you wrote several weeks ago, what are the moments in the novel that you might want to reflect on a little bit more, in the historical sources, anything in your paper that you want to think more about, refine, or complicate? Sort of set the agenda for the oral. We have questions for you, but we would love for you to sort of steer the conversation.
Yeah. So in my paper, I argued that Virginia Woolf uses To the Lighthouse as a reflection of her own person and her own time. And she uses the characters in the novel as different aspects of her own experience. So she aligns herself, for example, and her work as an author with the character Lily Briscoe and Lily's artwork, while characters like Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay represent the strictly Victorian influences that Woolf herself seems to have been very much influenced by, given what we've seen it from the historical sources. And basically I'm arguing that in her depiction of these characters, Woolf shows the contrast between the Victorian and modern ideals that she was caught in, literally in time. She was caught in between kind of the movement, or these two completely opposite movements. And so she shows how these standards really can affect one's ability to find meaning in life and in work. And I think that's something that she also struggled with herself a lot. And that's directly translated onto her pages in the novel.
You covered a lot there.
Yeah.
Really interesting, very layered.
Yeah. It was a super long novel, and there's just so much to unpack that it was really hard to look at just one thing. But I think because there was so much to unpack, a moment that I really wish I could have looked more into was the dinner party, because, well, I mean, it seems very incredibly important, and I think I found myself confused because it was a very long chapter and there was a lot going on. And in preparation for the exhibition, I was looking at the paper and I was rereading the book, and that I caught some moments that I wasn't able to look at before. So I think the biggest thing that I realized was, like, because this was my first time with a novel written in this manner, this stream of consciousness, and it took me a while to get used to that. And upon rereading it, I realized that a lot of it isn't just like a mess of thoughts as I first thought it to be. And there's a lot of intention behind the words that she's using. And even in some ways, that like messy feeling itself has intention behind it, because it's not meant to be like fully thought out ideas of these characters. And that's like the epitome of the dinner party, I think. In the beginning, all of these characters are, it's like switching back and forth from character to character, sitting around the table, and they're all thinking various thoughts, judging each other, etc. And in the moment where Mrs. Ramsay lights the candles, there's this sort of lull, and you can feel the characters kind of coming together in the way that like the stream of consciousness becomes a little bit more streamlined and not as jumbled together. And that was incredibly interesting to me. And so in my paper, I write about towards the end where Lily has that realization of Mrs. Ramsey's many lenses.
Yeah.
And I think I kind of focused on like the negative aspects of the lenses. And in this moment at the dinner party, there's kind of a beauty physically and metaphorically to Mrs. Ramsey, where although there are flaws to these like Victorian ideals that she stands by, maybe there are certain aspects of her kind of mother-like figure that brings these people together in this moment. And that was something that I was really interested in. And I can't believe I missed it, to be honest, because there's a lot to unpack there.
And that is really beautifully said. Because one of the things that we wanted you to do is exactly that, to flesh out Mrs. Ramsey a little bit more and sort of all of those different aspects of who she is.
Yeah.
Because I think it's very easy to see her, as you were describing, as this Victorian figure, a female figure, a mother, a wife, a hostess.
Mm-hmm.
So talk a little bit more about what you discovered at the dinner party and just sort of what is it about her beauty? Because it's not just physical beauty, as you were saying. There's more to who she is and what she does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I mean, kind of like you were just saying, upon first read, Mrs. Ramsey, at least to me, seemed like a sort of one-dimensional character. It was like very, just like the Victorian ideals were all that she cared about, and that was it. But this moment was, there are a lot of moments where she kind of seems like Lily Briscoe a lot, and kind of seems a lot like what I thought Virginia Woolf was commenting on through this novel. And in that, I mean, like, there's that moment where she like kind of takes a step back and looks at the scene from afar and considers it, or like says it's similar to a work of art. And that in this moment, perhaps all of these things, or this moment and all of these people and these relationships could be preserved. And that's something that she struggles with throughout the entire novel. And like in my paper and in my thinking, a lot of the time I thought her downfall was her Victorian ideals. It's like that's what prevented her from having preservation, or like the preservation that she wanted. But this moment kind of complicated that for me and made me realize maybe it's not only the downfall. And that's kind of what I was saying before, where I think I was painting Mrs. Ramsey in too negative of a light.
You talk about the moment. You just talked about the moment when the candles are lit.
Yeah.
And you set this up so beautifully because you said, they come into the dinner party and they're all thinking their own thoughts. They're all in their own heads. They all want to be somewhere else, right? And it is a jumble.
Yeah.
You described that so well. It's a jumble because everyone kind of resents having to come to the dinner party. And then the candles are lit. It's on my 97. Do you have it in your?
I didn't actually have it in my notes.
It's hard to locate in this long chapter, but I don't think I need to read this anyway, but the candles are lit and inside the room seem to be order and dry land. They are outside a reflection in which things wavered and vanished waterily. Some change had once went through them all as if this had really happened. They were all conscious of making a party together in a hollow on an island, had their common cause against the fluidity out there. Mrs. Ramsey, who had been uneasy waiting for Parliamented to come in and unable, she felt, to settle to things, now felt her uneasiness change to expectation. So the candles are lit. There's a kind of something happens to the party. And yeah, what role does Mrs. Ramsey play here? Later on, she's described as putting a spell on them all. What, can we just sort of figure out what it is? What is the magic of Mrs. Ramsey? She is beautiful physically, but what else is she able to do that makes her so compelling?
I don't know, that's something that I struggled with a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, Mrs. Ramsey is hard to unpack.
I mean, think of the other moments where there's a moment early in the novel when she and Mr. Tansley are walking into town. Do you remember that moment? And Mr. Tansley's a miserable man. Right? I mean, and as you draw the attention to his women can't write, women can't paint, right? Like he's just the worst. But what does she do with him there? Like she invites him to,
Yeah.
What does she do?
Tells her children not to make fun of him.
Yeah.
And to be kind to him.
And they walk into town and she lets him hold her bag.
Right.
And he feels great.
He feels manly.
He feels manly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing that you said, which I thought was really interesting, and this may be the lead into this great rereading that you're doing, is about 2 minutes ago you said actually Mrs. Ramsey is a lot like Lily Briscoe.
Mhm.
Can you just tell us about that? Because I think, first of all, I think that's a brilliant point. But can you tell us, as you look at these two sections, this large section in section 1 where Mrs. Ramsey is clearly the focus, and then section 3 where Lily and her painting are the focus, can you make any comparisons to how, like what did you mean when you said you were beginning to realize that Mrs. Ramsey is a little bit like Lily Briscoe, and maybe Lily Briscoe recognizes that too?
Yeah. I think it's hidden in there bit by bit. And the reason I said that in reference to the dinner party was I think there were a lot of moments there when there were similarities. So when Mrs. Ramsey sees it as the table seen as an work of art, and that is an act of preservation, which was kind of different from what she wanted to preserve before. She wanted just her kids to stay young and for her role as a mother to remain. And I guess in this moment, there are some aspects that she still wants in her role as a mother, but it seemed a little more like Lily, where Lily, throughout the entire novel, is trying to capture a single moment and put it down and make it last. And then Lily also, I don't exactly remember where, but there's a moment when she aligns herself with Mrs. Ramsey because it's when Mr. Tansley kind of pressures her into like sympathizing for him at the table, and then she thinks about how hard it must be for Mrs. Ramsey to have to deal with that all the time in her beauty as well, and how that beauty is kind of seen as this superficial thing, where and that moment Lily's recognizing that it's more than just that, and there's kind of a depth to it. And I actually write about that a little bit in my paper, where it's I wrote about how beauty had this penalty: it stole life, froze it. I paraphrased a little bit, but one forgot the little agitations. It was simpler to smooth that all out under the cover of beauty. And in my paper, I used that as an argument to talk about the stifling aspect of Victorianism, and how Mrs. Ramsey embodied that with her beauty. But I think upon rereading, it's more Lily aligning herself with Mrs. Ramsey and saying how hard it must be that all of the rough edges and all of these characteristics that make you not one-dimensional gets all swept under this branch of one-dimensional beauty.
Yeah.
And that was a moment that I kind of looked at differently after rereading.
You're doing a really interesting work, sort of also kind of complicating your your reading of how Lily sees Mrs. Ramsey. So can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of, what is it that Lily is so conflicted about in terms of her attitude towards Mrs. Ramsey?
Hmm.
What makes Mrs. Ramsey such a difficult person for Lily to kind of reconcile in terms of her own identity?
Yeah. I think it's hard. I mean, from Lily's perspective, it's all of these people are kind of pressuring her to that marriage is the way to go. And with Mr. Tansley saying women can't paint and women can't write, I guess to put myself in the mind of Lily Briscoe, it's really easy then if Mrs. Ramsey tells me that marriage is the only option for me, that to like brush it off and consider it just another part of these stifling Victorian ideals. But then when she, in these small moments when she sees Mrs. Ramsey's beauty and I think she refers to it as being in love with Mrs. Ramsey's
Yeah.
beauty.
Yes.
In those moments, it's really conflicting because that separates Mrs. Ramsey from the men who kind of just pressure Lily just to pressure her and for their own pleasure, I guess. I don't know.
That's beautifully said. I mean, you're right. Like Lily doesn't want to be a mother or a wife, as far as we know, right? So that she's resisting that part of Mrs. Ramsey's identity, and yet she finds Mrs. Ramsey really compelling, and aligns herself with, as you were saying, with Mrs. Ramsey, and maybe, and I think you were referring to a moment later in the novel. Maybe we could even go to that moment because when I think you mentioned this at the very beginning. He's talking about Mrs. Ramsey's art. Did you have that passage?
What moment exactly?
So I think it's in the third chapter of the third section.
Okay.
I think you were referring to this. It's probably a page and a half from chapter 4.
We have two different editions at the
Actually,
table here,
three.
which is why which is why we're navigating the page numbers here, but.
And it's a really interesting moment because it comes in a memory that Lily is having about a time on the beach where she and Charles Tansley actually have a moment that is okay. Hard to believe with Charles Tansley, but I don't know if you found the passage because it's so hard to locate. But the paragraph begins with Charles Tansley used to say that she remembered. But I'm gonna okay. So go into that paragraph a little bit and sort of towards the end of that long paragraph, and the sentence is that woman sitting there writing under the rock. You have that? Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at.
That's what you were referring to?
Yeah.
Do you want to read that?
Yeah.
And sort of up through the next paragraph?
That woman sitting there writing under the rock resolved everything into simplicity, made these angers, irritations fall off like old rags. She brought together this and that, and then this, and so made out of that miserable silliness and spite. She and Charles squabbling, sparring, had been silly and spiteful, something. This scene on the beach, for example, this moment of friendship and liking, which survived, after all these years complete, so that she dipped into it to refashion her memory of him. And there it stayed in the mind, affecting one almost like a work of art. Like a work of art, she repeated, looking from her canvas to the drawing room steps and back again. She must rest for a moment. And resting, looking from one to the other vaguely, the old question was which traversed the sky of the soul perpetually. The vast, the general question, which was apt to particularize itself at such moments as these. And she realized faculties that had been on the strain stood over her, paused over her, darkened her. What is the meaning of life? That was all. A simple question, one that tended to close in on one with years. The great revelation had never come.
Keep going.
The great revelation perhaps never did come. Instead, there were these little daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. Here was one. This, that, and the other. Herself and Charles Tansley and the breaking wave, Mrs. Ramsay bringing them together. Mrs. Ramsay saying, life stands still here. Mrs. Ramsay making of the moment something permanent. As in another sphere, Lily herself tried to make of the moment something permanent. This was of the nature of a revelation. In the midst of chaos, there was shape, this eternal passing and flowing. She looked at the clouds going and the leaves shaking, was struck into stability. Life stands still here, Mrs. Ramsay said. Mrs. Ramsay, she repeated. She owed it all to her.
There's a
Yeah,
lot there.
yeah. Reading it out loud was really different as well. Very,
What did you notice as you read it out loud?
I mean, this is slightly off topic, but I'm doing creative writing and we're doing poetry, and we're looking a lot at the punctuation of things when poetry is read aloud. And that's kind of what I noticed, kind of the way, almost like, I think into the Lighthouse, there's a lot of the references to the waves and this kind of flux of the wave coming in and out and the tide, and kind of that rhythm is almost there in this section that I read aloud. And also it's a mouthful to read some of these sentences.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think
You talk in your paper about Lily's sort of realization, and I think this is kind of a moment, right, where this is a realization. What is she recognizing here? What is she seeing about Mrs. Ramsay?
that in her ability to bring people together, she leaves lasting memories.
Mhm.
That as long as these people are alive, they will be able to, I think, like she says, dip back into and refashion her memory or their memory of the moment and of the people there, which is interesting too.
Yeah. I mean, all of it, you do such a good job in your paper, talking about sort of the resistance of the character's resistance of impermanence, and how both Mr. Ramsay, Mrs. Ramsay, and Lily are all obsessed with a kind of impermanence in life. All those dark kind of shadows that loom over them about things not lasting. So what you just said was like, actually, Mrs. Ramsay, the memory of Mrs. Ramsay and what she did, there's something permanent about this.
Yeah.
I mean, there it is. That memory is whole and kind of permanent for Lily. And it's a really important memory, because she's seeing, as you said earlier, sort of the art of Mrs. Ramsay and what she's doing here. So, and she says, almost like a work of art. Even her language there, right? So she dipped into it to refashion her memory of him, and there it stayed in the mind, affecting one almost like a work of art. So beautifully done. Why is it so important that she sees Mrs. Ramsay's work as a work of art? Or her methodology is a kind of artistic methodology?
Maybe because then Mrs. Ramsey does the exact opposite of what Charles Tansley says she can't do. Because that, I mean, I don't know, I mean, reading this, like I said before, I kept seeing Mrs. Ramsey as very one-dimensional and very dull, but maybe in painting what she does as a work of art, it's kind of going completely against that, like a full 180 and saying that, posing the question, does it really have to be this physical, tangible art for it to be something meaningful or something that is a work of art? Because I don't know, I think I find myself looking for tangible things to measure progress and to measure something successful. And maybe that's why I read Mrs. Ramsey in this way. But there's definitely a beauty to the way she's described to bring people together that has lasting significance clearly. So it kind of puts this purpose to her life and puts pressure on what people like myself would say, that she's dull and one-dimensional.
I also think what's interesting is we were talking about this a little bit before the tutorial began, is so the interiority and the stream of consciousness narrative allows Wolf to complicate both Lily and Mrs. Ramsey. And if you think about it, one of the things that's so interesting about this book as a post-World War novel is the whole notion of religion and the whole notion of coherence and faith is completely eliminated. So these are characters who are asking fundamental and existential and relatively desperate questions about the meaning of life. Like Mrs. Ramsey, although we normally think of her as this, majestic hostess, has some of the darkest thoughts of anyone in the novel, right? And I think what Wolf seems to be doing with this theory or this doctrine that she's exploring is beginning to try to figure out what it is in the 20th century that will give us hope and illumination and some element of permanence that's going to be different than a kind of religious permanence. And this, of course, leads to a really interesting question that is always, it's fascinated me. And you mentioned it, but I just love to push it a little bit further because of the questions of life and death in the book and the passage you just read. It's the only novel I know that actually raises the question of the meaning of life in the middle of the book. So it's a really important passage. So
that was all a simple question. What is the meaning of life?
So why does she die in parentheses in part 2? Like, so here's this, she dominates the novel, whether one loves her, fears her, finds her,
Simplifies her.
dubious. She dies in parentheses. Why? And what's the purpose of part 2, time passes? To ask another
That's a huge question.
complex question. Like, why
Right.
time passes? And can we tie this to this question that we just began to explore about the meaning of life?
Yeah. Wow. I kind of read it as, well, the first and third sections are really just like a day. And in that day, there's so much of these characters fretting. Well, in each day, there's so much of these characters fretting and worrying about the meaning of life and what they can do to preserve things. But then right in the middle of the novel, 10 years passes by like it's nothing. Mrs. Ramsey's entire life is restricted to a parenthetical. And so maybe that's Wolf's way of saying, I mean, I think I was kind of touching on this with you too last week, but like Wolf herself, there's a lot of confusion there and from what she writes, and there's still a lot of her working things out through this novel. That at least I think. And so maybe it's her exploring the meaning of life and saying maybe it's not, and there's not one incredibly important thing that we need to focus on. Which is also evident because all these characters are focusing on different things. Mr. Ramsey focuses on his work and Mrs. Ramsey on her children and whatnot. So to put this 10-year passage in a short amount of physical pages puts pressure on all these characters and all these people worrying about how their legacy might survive.
Yeah. So what is the significance of the arrival at the lighthouse at the end of the novel?
That is a question that I wanted to explore as well, but really struggled to.
And again, let's use this paradigm that we've been working on tonight. So we just created this paradigm and we said, all right, so part one is the dinner party. Part two is the trip to the lighthouse. And in the middle of this is this paragraph that you just read. And is there a way for us to take some of the polarity that you described in the paper and begin to think about, like, what is Wolf suggesting about a trip to the lighthouse 10 years later? Why do they go to the lighthouse? What's the purpose?
Yeah. I mean, if I'm going along with kind of what I was just touching on, there's a lot of Mrs. Ramsey fretting over also, like James and him remembering this for the rest of his life, that he'll never make it.
Yes.
And James being incredibly hateful to his father for all of these reasons. So maybe kind of like what I was saying, maybe there doesn't need to be such an importance on time and preservation through time. The final arrival is saying, I mean, he made it there eventually, right?
Mm-hmm.
He did make it there, and it took 10 years, but those 10 years passed by like it was nothing, at least in the novel. So yeah, I mean, maybe it's Wolf going along with that again, but I'm
Why is it so? The other thing which is so interesting is, why is it Lily standing with her painting on the lawn, watching them moving towards the lighthouse? What is that dual image at the end? Like, what's, because again, there it seems Wolf is again putting Lily in conversation with the Ramseys and Mrs. Ramsey again, right? So just to ask a really easy plot question. So at the moment they arrive at the lighthouse, Lily does what? What's her reaction to their arrival at the lighthouse? Let's look at it.
This is the last paragraph.
Yeah, let's look right at the end. Let's just read this passage at the end just to look at it, see what she does. So this is, I guess, the second to last page. He has landed, she said aloud. You see that?
Yep.
It is finished. Then surging up, puffing slightly, old Mr. Carmichael stood beside her, looking like an old pagan god, shaggy, with weeds in his hair and the trident, it was only a French novel, in his hand. He stood by her on the edge of the lawn, swaying a little in his bulk, and said, shading his eyes with his hand, "They will have landed." And she felt that she had been right. They had not needed to speak. They had been thinking the same things, and he had answered her without her asking him anything. He stood there spreading his hands over all the weakness and suffering of mankind. She thought he was surveying tolerantly, compassionately their final destiny, and now he has crowned the occasion, she thought, when his hand slowly fell as if she had seen him let fall from his great height a wreath of violets, asphodels, which, fluttering slowly, lay at length upon the earth. Quickly, as if she were recalled by something over there, she turned to her canvas. There it was, her picture. Yes, with all its greens and blues, its lines running up and across, its attempt at something. It would be hung in attics, she thought. It would be destroyed. But what did that matter, she asked herself, taking up her brush again. She looked at the steps, they were empty. She looked at her canvas, it was blurred. With a sudden intensity, as if she saw it clear for a second, she drew a line there, in the center. It was done, it was finished. Yes, she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue. I have had my vision. What do you make of that ending? We won't even deal with Mr. Carmichael. That's just such an amazing passage by him. Well, it's a whole nother paper, but.
Yeah, I think if Lily struggling throughout the entire novel to finish her painting is one destination, then James, or the character's destination to the lighthouse, is another. Physical divergence, but also like the metaphorical aspect of it. And if we're going back to the question of the meaning of life and kind of preservation and what it means to come to a vision, as Lily says, maybe there's more than one answer. And I there was a moment when Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey were going on their walk that I saw like a lot of conflicting. Well, I mean, not for the first or only time, but that was a moment where I recognized Mr. Ramsey kind of thinking, what if he's regretting having children and thinking that his work might have been better if he didn't have to care for his children. And Mrs. Ramsey is so taken aback that he would even, well, and he himself kind of stops himself, but Mrs. Ramsey wonders if he ever stops to look at the little things in life and and in that moment, I think Wolf poses the question, which one is right, or which character is correct, and which one is more meaningful? And in a moment like this, when Lily reaches the end of or completes her artwork, and James and Mr. Ramsey get to the lighthouse, it's doing that same thing, kind of putting pressure on just one answer and one destination for life and for people to reach.
So 2 other questions about this scene. One, why Lighthouse? How does the lighthouse play in the novel? And then why to the lighthouse rather than the lighthouse itself?
That's hard.
I mean, I think to put that question in conversation with what you were just talking about, like the different destinations, and I'm wondering if actually the title itself puts pressure on the emphasis on destination. Is it about the destination? Even though you're right, like she finishes the painting, they arrive at the lighthouse, but it is to the lighthouse. And the 3rd section is called The Lighthouse, but the novel is called To the Lighthouse.
Yeah.
And she even says it's attempt at something. It would be hung in the attic. She thought it would be destroyed, but what did that matter?
Yeah. And I guess a lighthouse is a kind of symbol for a guiding light in a period of darkness and confusion.
Yeah, that's
Right.
kind of where I was thinking about going to, is it's this beacon that helps ships get to where they need to get safely. And maybe perhaps also brings the ships together back to where they need to be.
Absolutely.
In the way at the dinner table, with the moment that light is lit, there's like a lull, there's this like peace in the room. So,
I mean, the image is there in the passage we were looking at earlier, right? There were little daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. I mean, you also alluded to the candles at the dinner party. So these images of light and illumination.
And I mean, it may be interesting, I think, that on the bottom of your page 8, you say to come back to this question of why to the lighthouse. You make the argument on the bottom of 8 that it doesn't matter to Lily that her art might be stuck in dusty attics or lost beneath couches because her work had meaning to herself.
Mm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Sort of thinking about some of what you've been thinking about, both in terms of Lily and in terms of maybe what she recognizes in Mrs. Ramsey as a kind of artist as well.
Hmm.
What are the implications of that great idea that you've arrived at the bottom there in conversation with the thinking you've just been doing during the oral?
Yeah. Well, going back to the lighthouse versus the lighthouse, maybe it's all about, at least for James when he's a kid, and what Mrs. Ramsey worries over is like getting there. It's not necessarily the lighthouse itself, and that's why the novel itself is called To the Lighthouse. It's about what it means to the people to get there, not necessarily what the lighthouse itself stands for, or even once you get there, what it might entail. Because we don't get any more information after they land. They
Yeah.
land and that's it.
Yeah.
That's all that matters. And the same way that Lily, like I wrote here, all that matters is that she was able to finish it in a way that was meaningful to herself. And as you just asked, Ms. Pressman, the same goes for Mrs. Ramsey, and that's why Lily kind of respects that, is that where it's easy to think that it might be because of whatever Victorian ideals she lives up to, it's something that is meaningful to her to be able to care for her children and to be able to preserve these memories and these friendships. So the fact that she's able to do that makes it a work of art. Yeah.
So can we make the jump, and this is something that you're doing in the paper in a number of places, then to thinking about the implications of that for Woolf as a novelist and as someone who, in writing the novel, is herself engaged in the process of a work of art?
Yeah, I was, that was another part of that I was really focusing on during the exhibition preparation. And I think there was that in one of the sources that writes about at the height of modernism, art strived to paint or to depict how not what was shown, but how it made one feel.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this novel is a work of art. And then also, yeah, I came to this last night when I was preparing, because Woolf also talks about in her recording that words will change and it will mean something different to each generation and the next. And that was something that really stuck with me. And maybe it's the exact same for this. And I kind of saw this novel as, on one hand, a work of art, and another as words on a page. And both have meaning, but for Woolf, because the words on the page literally depict what it was like to live for her during this time. But also, these words have changed, because I mean, I never experienced any of this. We're generations later, so there's not the same exact meaning to these words. But if you look at it as a work of art overall, and as a work of art during the height of modernism, this novel is depicting what it feels like to have lived during these times, and what it feels like for all of these characters to contemplate the meaning of life, or to reach whatever goal they want to reach. And that is something that, like in the novel and like in these sources described, has a lasting effect, something that stays through generations. And I don't think there's more importance in one or the other, because both are incredibly meaningful. It's just that one clearly cannot stand the test of time, in that I don't know what it was like to live then firsthand, but it's still very meaningful. And kind of that's going back to what we were saying. Lily's painting might be destroyed or in an attic, but it's still meaningful to her, and it's still meaningful. I think it would be meaningful to anyone who saw it, years later. I don't know. And so I kind of saw all this contemplation of impermanence as a reflection of her, as I was saying earlier, her own confusion about her work and what it means to be an author and what it means to make something that lasts. And if it can last, right? Because, like, as she says, these words will mean something different in generations to come. And that's something that really stuck with me. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a kind of emphasis on like the creative process itself. That has meaning.
Yeah, definitely.
So when she's thinking back to Mrs. Ramsey and when Lily is thinking back to what Mrs. Ramsey can do, and she's able to recognize that Mrs. Ramsey is an artist, then she no longer has the same kind of conflict with her as a mother or a wife, right?
Right.
It's like, oh, she's an artist too. She just has a different canvas. Her canvas, her dinner parties, or the beautiful scene in the nursery when she puts her kids to bed, or, how she makes people feel. So she's really honoring and recognizing and understanding Mrs. Ramsey as an artist and the meaning in the creative process.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the product at the end. Even though here we, have this
The
product.
But sorry, I love what you said in the beginning about her emphasis on the process, because there's this moment, I don't exactly remember where, but when it vividly describes Lily kind of in this feverish moment, painting a stroke by stroke in a rhythmic tidal way. Yeah. And Woolf talks about that in her essay as well, what it felt like to write at night. And so, I don't know, that really, I remember reading that image. And they kind of call it like the zone, right? No matter what you do, you get in the zone of things and you don't know exactly what you're doing, but it's working.
And artists feel that. I mean, you're a musician.
Yeah.
Yeah, like when things are coming together, right? And that's what Lily throughout the whole, she can't bring her painting together. She's painting Mrs. Ramsey and James, but she has this problem in the painting, right? And then suddenly she has, she can paint that stroke and it comes together. But there is a kind of moment when you are in the zone, something happens. And it happens at parties, or it happens at Mrs. Ramsey's dinner parties anyway. But there's that unity and coherence, in the midst of chaos. And it is such a beautiful doctrine, right, of trying to achieve those moments of unity and coherence, even though they're not lasting. And I think of Mrs. Ramsey at the end of the dinner party. She's just had this incredible creation, and she is watching it dissipate and vanish. And then she hears her kids fighting up in their room. And she's like, oh my God, I have to go put these kids to bed. Here I go again. And she picks herself up, and the creative process starts all over again. So it's an ongoing process. Andrew, great job. We have so much more I want to talk to you about, because we didn't even get to Mr. Ramsey, really.
The Blessed Island of
That was my
Good
next question.
I know. We have to talk more, because one of my favorite scenes is the scene with Lily and Mr. Ramsey when she admires his boots. So at some point, we'll talk about that, okay? In the meantime, we would love to answer any questions about anything you just saw or heard, or anything about the senior exhibition project.
And by we certainly mean Andrew as
Yes,
well.
Andrew,
So feel free
panelist.
So if
to
you
have
wanna-
questions for him.
Yeah, so
That's
in
part of
the,
that.
if you can put it in the Q&A, we will,
Do you have the Q&A?
no, but we will. Questions about anything? Got 2 English teachers, a history teacher, senior, brilliant senior over here, who's just taken it from 3 teachers beautifully. A lot to think about.
I'm going to ask a question that's sort of a question to you, Andrew, about your process. Did you, given the extent to which you were already thinking about this in your paper and that we were just talking about now, about sort of the power of process, does that make you think at all about sort of your own process as a writer and sort of what it felt like to be writing this
Yeah,
paper?
definitely. It was when Mrs. Roach said something about, when she referenced the process, I immediately thought of the paper because Mrs. Roach always used to talk about the drafting process and how it's so important, which is something that I learned because of you last year. It was when you said it was an ongoing thing. That's what made me think of that, because that's what you taught me these past 2 years, is that it never really ends. And the discussion and the conversation never really ends. And that's why I love doing the exhibition so much, because it's, I don't know, there's so much to unpack right now that blew over my head at first. So yeah, I think the process of writing takes a very long time, and especially in a class like this, where, especially for this novel, I had the entire paper, or a lot of the ideas that I wanted to have down, and then I looked at the historical sources when you gave them to us. I said, oh, there's a lot more there, because I didn't really know the background in Woolf's life, or the background to Victorianism and modernism, and kind of how they clashed. And so that opened up a whole new lens in this whole new world of focus. And even the idea of stream of consciousness, I didn't really know what that was either until those sources. And then I just had to reread like 2 or 3 times just to catch everything again that I missed.
I mean, that really speaks to what you did in this drafting process, because you integrated the sources so
well.
deeply and seamlessly. If you'd written a full draft without the sources and then you bring in the sources, you completely reshaped your argument.
Yeah.
And so the paper itself is evidence of really deep commitment to an engagement in the whole process.
And then the oral becomes that next layer of it, and all the thinking that you just did. And I mean, even the ways, I think there's something maybe a little tricky about the Angel in the House essay, because I think you did such good thinking about it and sort of what Woolf is struggling with there. And yet, interestingly, in the novel, Lily, and then as you were sort of suggesting, Woolf herself seems to be able to reconcile a reading of Mrs. Ramsay that's more generous, I think, than Woolf's reading in the essay of The Angel of the House, or sort of a recognition that Mrs. Ramsay is more than that. So I think that's really, really interesting in terms of again, sort of the layers of your process. So
I think the other thing which is interesting is that, in terms of Woolf herself, I think she definitely believed that her mother died of exhaustion. So I think we sense that in several aspects of Mrs. Ramsay's character and in the first section that there is a tremendous emphasis on just the incredible effort and energy she has to
Depletion,
give,
utter
the depletion
depletion,
to the
utter
family.
depletion.
Yeah.
And I think at the same time, I think as she wrote the novel, even as she was, her sister was an artist and Wolf herself was remaking the novel. So there's clearly something going on here, which is very revolutionary. And at the same time, I think she was trying to strive for some sort of synthesis that would bring together everything that she had seen, that she began to see is somehow very heroic and creative despite the limitations of the Victorian. Yeah. And I think her father was an eminent scholar, and someone who clearly influenced her intellectual life, but you can see there's a lot there.
Yeah.
Mr. Ramsey is her father.
Yeah.
There's a lot being worked out there.
Yeah. So we have a question, which is, are there any requirements needed in order to participate in a senior exhibition? And actually, there are no requirements at all. Every senior does a senior exhibition. So it's something that we really prepare the students for from the moment they sit in an English classroom. It's scaffolded through their career here until their senior year. And during the winter of their senior year, they work on this independent senior exhibition project. So every senior does a senior exhibition.
And I think the genesis, if you think about it, was this goes back how many years now?
Over 20 years.
So it's an over a 20-year process, and it began at a moment where we were asking ourselves, like, okay, so what would constitute an exhibition of mastery in the humanities? And the word exhibition came from Ted Sizer from Brown University, the Coalition of Essential Schools, and he was basically saying that he wasn't interested in rote learning or memorization. He was interested in authentic demonstration of intellectual flexibility, creativity, and mastery, which is really what Andrew's demonstrated tonight. And so we said to ourselves, all right, so what we'll do is we'll move away from the advanced placement program, we'll move away from these kinds of standardized things. We'll basically say, what would be the highest form of humanities scholarship? And we knew that the highest form was the thesis and the thesis defense, or the thesis moment with teachers surrounding you, and you have the ability to talk really powerfully and intelligently. And St. Andrews students for 20 some years have just continued to raise the bar in these amazing ways. And it's been astonishing for me to watch it over these 2 decades. And I think it's definitely a hallmark of the kind of teaching and learning that takes place in all the disciplines at St. Andrews.
And I think it's even, in some sense, it's more interesting than the sort of PhD thesis defense, because it's actually meant deliberately not to be a defense, right? Like you came in and had already rethought and wanted to do more and wanted to think in new ways. And I think that's actually one of the things that I'm most impressed by, is that students just fully embrace, as we saw Andrew do tonight. It's like, I am so excited for this chance to do more, as opposed to just sort of like, I'm here to sort of be rigidly defending what I already arrived at.
I think when Elizabeth and I began our careers here, there was the sense that intellectual debate was putting your argument in the sand and not moving it ever. So this has actually been Elizabeth and Emily's vision, that real intellectual discourse is about flexibility and listening to other people and openness. And I think it's flowered here in really powerful ways.
And it does, as I described it at the beginning, it's about imagining what the next version of your paper would be. So there's never a perfect paper. You never stop thinking. So it kind of takes a pressure off to think that you have to do everything in a paper and you're going to achieve something, because it actually makes the learning, it makes the learning more rigorous, and as a result, actually more fun and exciting, because you're kind of open to possibility at all times. So I think we've done over an hour. Andrew, thank you so much. And thank you all for attending. And feel free to send us any questions by email if you think of something after we end this webinar. So good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.